Picture this: a city under siege, but not just by swords or battering rams. The real battle wasn't fought on the walls. It was waged in the minds of those trapped inside. Imagine the weight of silence before the first arrow flies, the tension in the air as whispers of starvation spread, the chilling sight of smoke rising from distant fields, your enemy's way of telling you there's no escape. This wasn't just about brute force, it was a war of nerves, a test of willpower where the strongest defenses could crumble without a single stone being loosened. Ancient commanders knew something we often forget. The quickest way to conquer a city wasn't through its gates, but through the fears of the people behind them. From the earliest civilizations, sieges were masterclasses in psychological manipulation. Think of the Trojan horse, not just a clever trick, but a stroke of genius designed to exploit hope itself. The Greeks didn't just breach Troy's walls, they made the Trojans believe they'd won, only to deliver the final blow when their guard was down. Or consider the siege of Jerusalem in the 1st century, where the Romans cut off food supplies and let desperation do the rest. Hunger turned neighbor against neighbor, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapon was patience. These weren't just battles, they were elaborate performances where every move, from fake retreats to forged letters, was calculated to unravel the enemy's resolve. But here's the fascinating part. For every city that fell to these mind games, there were those that refused to break. What made the difference? Was it unshakable leadership, unbreakable community bonds, or sheer stubbornness? And how do these ancient tactics still linger in the way conflicts unfold today? Over the next few minutes, we'll step into the shadows of history's most infamous sieges, uncovering the hidden strategies that decided who stood tall and who surrendered. This isn't just a story of conquest, it's a lesson in human psychology, a reminder that the most powerful battles are often the ones we can't see. So let's begin where the real fight started, not with swords but with the mind. To understand siege warfare is to step into a waiting game where time itself became a weapon. Ancient armies didn't just surround a city, they orchestrated an entire theater of dread. Cut off from supplies, the defenders would watch their food dwindle, their water turn foul, and their allies fail to arrive. But the true genius lay in how attackers manipulated these slow-burning crises. Take the siege of Carthage, where the Romans didn't just blockade the city, they burned its surrounding fields, filling the air with smoke visible from the walls. Every drifting plume was a reminder, no harvest would come, no help would save them. It wasn't just about physical deprivation. It was about stripping away the illusion of safety day by day. And yet, some cities defied the odds, turning their walls into stages for defiance. During the siege of Syracuse, the inventor Archimedes became a one-man morale booster, designing ingenious war machines that made the Romans question their own tactics. His creations are from giant claws that plucked ships from the sea to mirrors that set sails ablaze weren't just tools of war. They were psychological lifelines, proving that human ingenuity could outmatch sheer numbers. For every defender who cracked under pressure, there were those who rallied around symbols of resistance, whether it was a leader's stirring speech or the shared belief that their cause was sacred. The most devastating sieges, though, preyed on the fractures within. Attackers didn't just starve cities, they sowed discord. In ancient China, besieging armies would launch messages over the walls with arrows, promising rewards to anyone who opened the gates. The real target wasn't the gate itself, but the trust between neighbors. Would loyalty hold, or would hunger twist allies into betrayers? This was warfare stripped to its rawest form, not just metal against stone, but fear against hope, despair against unity. And in that struggle, the true measure of a city's strength wasn't its walls. It was the unbreakable will of those standing behind them. Isolation was more than just a military strategy. It was a slow, suffocating grip on hope itself. When a city's gates closed and the enemy's encircling walls rose, the message was unmistakable: you are alone. Ancient commanders understood that cutting off supply lines wasn't just about starvation. It was about severing the lifeline of morale. Take the siege of Megara in the 4th century BC, where the attackers didn't just blockade the city. They spread rumors that neighboring allies had already surrendered. With no way to verify the truth, the defenders were left to wrestle with doubt, wondering if resistance was futile. The real weapon wasn't the sword, it was the unbearable silence where news used to be. Food shortages played their part, but the psychological unraveling often began with something subtler: the erosion of routine. Imagine a city where the markets fell quiet, where the familiar rhythm of trade caravans vanished. Without fresh word from the outside, even the bravest defenders started questioning. Had their king abandoned them? Were the gods displeased? The Assyrians mastered this art, leaving intercepted letters where defenders could find them, each one carefully forged to hint at betrayal or divine wrath. These weren't just lies, they were seeds of chaos, designed to sprout paranoia in the fertile soil of isolation. Yet some cities turned isolation into a strange kind of strength. During the siege of Plataea, the trapped Greeks rationed their supplies with near mathematical precision, turning scarcity into a shared sacrifice. Their defiance wasn't just physical, it was a collective refusal to let despair take root. But for every Plataea, there were cities like Babylon, where isolation exposed fractures in the social order. When the Persians diverted the Euphrates River, they didn't just deprive the city of water, they revealed who hoarded resources and who starved. The true battle wasn't at the walls, it was in the whispered accusations between neighbors, the growing suspicion that survival might require turning on one another. Isolation's cruelest trick was making time itself an enemy. Days blurred into weeks, and with each passing moment, the mind conjured horrors worse than reality. Ancient siege accounts speak of defenders hallucinating from hunger, of soldiers hearing phantom footsteps in empty streets. The Carthaginians, besieged by Rome for 3 years, reportedly resorted to eating leather and roots, but what broke them wasn't just the hunger. It was the creeping realization that the world beyond had moved on, leaving them trapped in a nightmare without end. This was psychological warfare at its most primal, not just conquering land, but dismantling the very will to resist. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of siege warfare, it was a carefully staged performance. Ancient commanders knew that terror could accomplish what battering rams couldn't, and they turned their camps into theaters of psychological domination. The Assyrians didn't simply execute prisoners, they displayed them along the walls in grotesque tableaus, ensuring defenders would witness the fate awaiting resistors. When Roman legions built siege towers taller than city walls, it wasn't just for height advantage, it was to cast literal and metaphorical shadows over the defenders below. Every flaming arrow arcing through the night sky carried 2 messages, one of fire, the other of inescapable doom. The most chilling spectacles often happened beyond arrow range, where attackers could manipulate perception without risk. Alexander the Great's engineers once constructed a bridge of boats across the Tigris, not for crossing, but to demonstrate their limitless resources. A show of engineering prowess meant to demoralize defenders watching from Babylon's walls. During the siege of Masada, the Romans spent months building an immense ramp of earth and stone, each basket of dirt hauled uphill serving as a visible countdown to destruction. The real genius of these displays lay in their ambiguity. defenders never knew whether they were witnessing genuine preparations or elaborate bluffs designed to hasten surrender. Some spectacles targeted cultural nerves with surgical precision. When the Mongols besieged cities, they would catapult plague victims over the walls, not just as biological warfare, but as a violation of sacred burial customs. The Carthaginians, besieging Acrogas, launched pots of snakes into the city, exploiting primal fears while mocking their enemies' symbol of wisdom. Even sounds became weapons. Celtic tribes would blast eerie war horns before dawn, using dissonant notes to disrupt sleep and fray nerves. These weren't random acts of cruelty but calibrated strikes against the human psyche, each one whispering the same question: how much horror are you willing to endure? Yet for all their theatrical brutality, these fear campaigns sometimes backfired spectacularly. When the Spartans at Plataea saw the Persians gilding their whips in plain view, it didn't intimidate them, it revealed their enemies' arrogance and strengthened their resolve. The defenders of Tyre responded to Alexander's siege mole by catapulting burning sand over the walls, turning his own engineering feat into an instrument of his soldiers' agony. In these moments, the spectacle became a double-edged sword, proving that terror could unite as easily as it could divide. The true test wasn't in the horror displayed, but in whether a city's shared identity could withstand the assault on their collective mind. What made these spectacles so effective wasn't their violence, but their ability to colonize imagination. A single flaming projectile might burn one house, but the memory of its arc could ignite panic in thousands. Ancient commanders understood something modern psychologists confirm: that human fear responds more powerfully to anticipated threats than present dangers. By turning sieges into gruesome performances, they weaponized anticipation itself, making defenders surrender to horrors they hadn't yet experienced. The greatest victory came not when the gates fell, but when those inside began believing they were already defeated. Deception was the invisible dagger in the siege commander's arsenal, a weapon that could turn trust into a fatal weakness. The Trojan horse wasn't just an outlier, it was the pinnacle of a dark art practiced across civilizations. Imagine defenders peering over their walls, watching an enemy army suddenly retreat in disarray. Relief might flood their hearts until they realized the retreat was staged, their gates thrown open in celebration only to meet a slaughter. The Mongols perfected this, feigning panic to lure defenders into pursuit, then encircling them in the open field. False retreats worked because they exploited a universal human flaw: the temptation to believe the threat had passed. But why stop at military theatrics? Ancient besiegers manipulated perception itself. During Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, his troops lit thousands of extra campfires each night, transforming a modest force into the illusion of an endless horde. The defenders, counting flames from their walls, didn't see fire, they saw inevitability. Similarly, Ottoman armies besieging Constantinople floated massive wooden platforms painted to resemble siege towers down the Bosporus. The ruse forced defenders to waste precious resources reinforcing the wrong sections of walls. These weren't just tricks, they were psychological equations, calculating exactly how much doubt would crack resolve. The most insidious deceptions targeted faith and superstition. Assyrian commanders would launch clay tablets over city walls, inscribed with prophecies of divine abandonment. Carthaginian generals timed attacks to coincide with eclipses, letting nature itself whisper of celestial wrath. When the Romans besieged Jerusalem, they catapulted food into the starving city not from mercy, but to spark infighting over who deserved it. Every loaf was a seed of discord, proving that the right lie at the right moment could rot solidarity from within. Yet deception's power had limits. clever defenders turned the tables, like the Byzantines who dangled hollow metal statues over their walls during a siege, filling them with burning coals to mimic divine fire. The attackers, convinced of supernatural intervention, faltered, or the defenders of Rhodes, who painted their walls with invisible symbols that only appeared under moonlight, convincing besiegers the city was protected by magic. In the end, the best counter to deception wasn't just vigilance, it was creativity, the ability to spin illusions faster than the enemy could unravel them. What made these tactics so enduring wasn't their cruelty, but their understanding of human nature. A well-placed rumor could do more damage than 1,000 arrows because it weaponized the space between ears. When reality became fluid, even the strongest walls became irrelevant because the real battlefield was always the mind. Time was the siege commander's most patient soldier, a force that never tired, never retreated, and always won in the end. Unlike swords or arrows, its power worked silently, gnawing at discipline as relentlessly as termites in wood. Ancient strategists understood something profound. You could rebuild a broken wall, but you couldn't restore lost hope once time had hollowed it out. The siege of Vicksburg during the American Civil War mirrored this ancient truth. After 47 days under Union blockade, Confederate soldiers were so starved they reportedly ate rats and boiled shoe leather, yet what truly broke them wasn't the hunger itself. It was watching their pocket watches tick through endless, identical days with no relief in sight. The cruel genius of time as a weapon lay in its invisibility. No defender could stab at it or block it with shields. During the siege of Candia in the 17th century, the Ottomans waited 21 years for Venetian defenses to crack, not through any dramatic assault, but by letting generations of defenders grow up knowing nothing but confinement and scarcity. Children became adults behind those walls, their entire lives shaped by the slow bleed of resources. Leaders who began the siege full of fiery rhetoric were often replaced by pragmatists willing to negotiate, as the original reasons for resistance faded into distant memory. Time didn't just weaken bodies, it rewired loyalties. Hunger was time's most effective lieutenant. Accounts from the siege of Samaria describe mothers secretly boiling their own children for food, a horror so unthinkable it became the ultimate benchmark of despair in ancient texts. Yet even here, the true damage wasn't just physical. The knowledge that your neighbor might see you as meat eroded the social contracts holding the city together. Why maintain discipline when survival demanded betrayal? Why obey leaders who couldn't fill bellies? The Romans exploited this brilliantly during the siege of Numancia, where they allowed sporadic food shipments into the Spanish city, not from mercy, but to create vicious infighting over who deserved the scraps. Alliances crumbled fastest under time's weight. The besieged city of Megara held out valiantly against Sparta until whispers spread that their Athenian allies had abandoned them. With no way to verify the claim, leaders spent precious days debating whether to trust old loyalties or cut their losses. By the time they learned the rumor was false, internal factions had already formed, each accusing the other of cowardice or treason. This was time's subtlest cruelty. It turned uncertainty into a poison that paralyzed decision-making. The longer a siege dragged on, the more every creak of a gate or rustle in the night became evidence of betrayal. Yet some cities weaponized time in return. During the siege of Leyden in the 16th century, Dutch defenders deliberately flooded their own lands rather than surrender, turning the surrounding countryside into an impassable swamp. The Spanish besiegers, unprepared for a prolonged wait in watery trenches, found their own supplies rotting as morale disintegrated. Here, time became a double-edged sword. The very patience meant to break defenders could backfire when attackers grew homesick or ran low on funds. Even the mighty Mongols occasionally lifted sieges not because they were beaten, but because their nomadic armies grew restless after months of inactivity. The most fascinating sieges were those where time revealed unexpected resilience. When the Ottomans blockaded Malta in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller transformed their fortresses into models of communal endurance. They rationed bread by weight, rotated guard shifts to prevent exhaustion, and even maintained a makeshift hospital, proving that disciplined routines could stretch limited resources far beyond expectations. Their secret wasn't thicker walls or sharper swords, but an unshakable belief that their cause could outlast any timeline. In these rare cases, time didn't erode resolve, it forged it into something unbreakable. What separated the cities that collapsed from those that endured often came down to a single factor: the ability to make time feel meaningful rather than oppressive. Rituals mattered, whether daily prayers, shared meals, or rotating work details. They carved order from chaos, giving defenders milestones to reach for when calendars blurred together. The ancient world's greatest siege commanders knew this psychological truth instinctively. Their victory wasn't marked by the day the walls fell, but by the moment defenders stopped believing tomorrow could be better than today. Leadership wasn't just about giving orders, it was the fragile thread holding a besieged city's spirit together. Ancient attackers knew that to break a city's resistance, they didn't need to defeat every soldier. They just needed to sever that thread. The moment defenders stopped believing in their commanders, discipline unraveled like a frayed rope. Take the infamous siege of Harfleur in the 15th century, where Henry V didn't just bombard the walls. He systematically targeted the town's council members with personal threats, making sure each missive reached their families first. Within weeks, the leaders who'd vowed to fight to the last began urging surrender, not from cowardice, but because their people begged them to end the nightmare. Assassination was the bluntest instrument in this dark arsenal. When the Mongols besieged Nishapur, they didn't just kill the city's governor. They mounted his head on a spear and paraded it through the streets, ensuring every defender understood the price of defiance. But subtlety could be just as effective. During Rome's siege of Veii, spies spread rumors that the Etruscan king had made secret deals with the enemy. The whispers grew so loud that by the time the truth emerged, the city had already fractured into warring factions. A leader's greatest strength, their connection to the people, became their fatal vulnerability when trust eroded. Bribery offered a quieter path to chaos. The Byzantines kept meticulous lists of every noble in cities they planned to besiege, noting who had gambling debts, who coveted a rival's land, who might trade loyalty for gold. When Constantinople itself faced siege centuries later, the Ottomans used the same tactic, secretly promising key officials wealth and power if they sabotaged defenses from within. The brilliance of bribery lay in its ambiguity. Defenders never knew whether a sudden shortage of arrows or a mysteriously unlocked gate was bad luck or betrayal. Paranoia did the rest. Public humiliation could break a city faster than any battering ram. Ancient accounts describe besiegers forcing captured leaders to perform degrading acts in view of their people kneeling before enemy commanders, wearing peasant rags, even being paraded in makeshift cages. The Assyrians took this further, staging elaborate mock coronations where they crowned puppets atop the walls, reducing sacred traditions to farce. Each spectacle chipped away at the aura of authority until the very idea of leadership felt like a joke. Yet some cities defied the odds by redistributing power when traditional leaders fell. During the siege of Tyre, when the Persian governor fled, the citizens didn't collapse. They formed a council of merchants, priests, and soldiers, creating a new kind of unity that outlasted the initial shock. Similarly, when the Spanish conquistadors captured the Aztec emperor Montezuma, They expected Tenochtitlan to surrender instantly. Instead, the people elected new war leaders, proving that true resilience often lay not in individuals but in shared purpose. The most fascinating cases were sieges where leaders turned their vulnerability into strength. At the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc didn't just rally troops. She deliberately placed herself in arrow range during assaults, transforming every near miss into proof of divine protection. The defenders didn't just follow her orders, they absorbed her certainty that victory was inevitable. This was the ultimate counter to leadership attacks, when a figure became so synonymous with resistance that removing them only amplified their legend. What made leadership such a pivotal target wasn't just the loss of strategy, but the collapse of narrative. People could endure hunger, cold, and danger if they believed their suffering had meaning. A single captured general's head catapulted over the walls didn't just kill a man, it killed the story defenders told themselves about why they kept fighting. Yet history's greatest sieges remind us that while leaders might ignite courage, the embers often glowed long after they were gone, kept alive by ordinary people who decided their city's identity was worth more than any one life. Religion wasn't just part of ancient warfare, it was the battlefield itself. When armies surrounded a city, they didn't just attack walls, they waged war on the gods the defenders trusted. The Assyrians were masters of this, staging elaborate mock rituals outside besieged cities, dressing their own priests in captured sacred garments to communicate with enemy deities. Imagine watching from the ramparts as foreign hands touched objects your people believed only the pure could hold, each movement designed to make you question whether your gods had switched sides. Some commanders went further, weaponizing prophecy itself. During the Siege of Tyre, Alexander's advisors discovered an ancient text predicting the city's fall, making sure copies reached defenders' hands. The Romans besieging Jerusalem circulated forged Sibylline verses warning of divine abandonment, exploiting the Jewish belief in sacred signs. These weren't lies so much as psychological traps, because even if defenders doubted the messages, the seeds of uncertainty had been planted. Could they truly risk ignoring what might be a warning from heaven itself? Temple desecration became the ultimate psychological strike. When the Persians captured Babylon, they didn't just occupy Marduk's sanctuary, they staged a grotesque parody of the New Year ritual, deliberately mishandling sacred statues in view of horrified citizens. The message was clear: your gods are powerless to stop us. The Carthaginians took this further during the Sicilian Wars, tossing captured Greek votive offerings into latrines where besieged defenders could retrieve them, now defiled. Every act was calculated to erode not just morale, but the very cosmology that held society together. Yet defenders fought back with divine theater of their own. In Constantinople's darkest hour, priests paraded the Virgin Mary's robe along the walls as Ottoman cannons boomed, and when a sudden storm scattered the attackers' fleet, the miracle brought weeks of renewed resolve. The Aztecs hurled sacred flint knives from their pyramids during Cortez's siege, each one blessed to seek Spanish hearts. Even fabricated omens could work. Medieval chronicles tell of besieged cities finding ancient crosses in their walls or releasing doves that miraculously avoided enemy arrows. The line between faith and psychological warfare blurred completely in moments like the Siege of Rhodes. When Ottoman sappers tunneled beneath Christian defenses, defenders lowered consecrated icons into the tunnels, not as spiritual shields, but because the silver plating detected underground vibrations like primitive seismographs. The faithful saw divine intervention, the engineers saw physics. Both were right. This duality made religious tactics so potent. They spoke simultaneously to logic and to something deeper than reason. Perhaps the cruelest twist came when attackers hijacked a city's own theology. The Mongols, besieging Muslim cities, would wait until Friday prayers before launching their loudest assaults, knowing the faithful would be gathered in vulnerable groups. Spanish conquistadors timed attacks to coincide with Aztec festival days when defenders were ritually weakened by bloodletting. These weren't just tactical choices, they were metaphysical strikes, turning sacred time into a weapon against those who hallowed it. What made religious warfare so devastating was its self-reinforcing nature. A single miracle, whether staged or coincidental, could spiral into mass conviction. When the walls of Jericho supposedly fell to trumpet blasts, or when a solar eclipse answered defenders' prayers, such events didn't just change morale, they rewrote reality for those who witnessed them. Ancient commanders grasped a truth modern armies often forget. In the darkness of a siege, people don't cling to swords or bread nearly as tightly as they cling to meaning. And nothing gives meaning or takes it away quite like the divine. The greatest conquerors understood a fundamental truth: sometimes the most powerful weapon was the illusion that you couldn't be stopped. Alexander the Great didn't just march into cities, he staged spectacles designed to make resistance feel like defying the tides. Before his army even appeared on the horizon, stories would spread tales of his divine birth, whispers of oracles predicting his victories, exaggerated accounts of cities that had dared oppose him and been erased from memory. By the time his troops arrived, defenders were already half defeated, their will sapped by the crushing weight of inevitability. This wasn't just about intimidation, it was about rewriting reality. When Alexander besieged Tyre, he didn't hide the construction of his massive siege mole. He let defenders watch as his engineers transformed the sea itself into a road. Every basket of dirt hauled into place was a silent proclamation. No barrier could hold him. The Mongols perfected this theater of invincibility, deliberately allowing a few survivors to escape their massacres. These witnesses became living prophecies, carrying warnings to the next city: surrender or be erased. The terror didn't come from violence alone. It came from the certainty that no walls, no armies, no gods could protect you. Even the natural world could be conscripted into this illusion. Julius Caesar's writings famously described how his men built a bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, not because he needed to cross, but to demonstrate Roman engineering could conquer any obstacle. The Ottomans, besieging Constantinople, hauled ships overland to bypass the city's chain defenses, not just as a tactical move, but as a statement: your strongest tricks are child's play to us. These feats weren't just practical, they were psychological earthquakes, shaking the defenders' faith in their own defenses. Yet the most brilliant commanders knew invincibility was a fragile mirage. When the Spartan king Agesilaus faced a vastly larger Persian force, he ordered his men to casually exercise naked within view of the enemy, projecting such indifference to their numbers that the Persians hesitated to attack. The Byzantines once repelled an Arab fleet by loading their few remaining ships with flammable materials and setting them adrift toward the enemy, not to burn ships, but to create the illusion they had endless fire weapons to spare. The attackers, convinced they faced an unstoppable force, withdrew. What made these illusions so devastating was their self-fulfilling nature. Once defenders believed a conqueror was inevitable, they started interpreting every setback as proof. A failed sortie wasn't bad luck, it was destiny. A cracked wall wasn't repairable damage, it was a sign the gods had abandoned them. The real mastery lay not in being invincible, but in making your enemy certain you were. And in that certainty, cities surrendered not to armies, but to their own unraveling hope. Negotiation was the silent blade that could cut sieges short before the first drop of blood was spilled. While history remembers the fallen walls and flaming arrows, some of the most decisive battles happened not on ramparts, but across negotiating tables where words carried the weight of lives. Take the siege of Aleppo in the 12th century, when Saladin's forces surrounded the city. His messengers didn't just deliver ultimatums. They brought detailed accounts of neighboring towns that had surrendered peacefully, their markets still bustling, their children unharmed. Contrast that with vivid descriptions of cities that had resisted to the end, where survivors wished they'd chosen differently. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was psychological judo, using the defenders' own imagination against them. The genius of negotiation lay in its flexibility. A skilled commander could offer honey or vinegar depending on what would crack resolve. When the Mongols approached a wealthy trading city, they might promise tax reductions and protected trade routes if the gates opened by dawn. But let the sun rise on closed gates, and the same envoys would return with sketches of the massacre at the last city that defied them. The art was in calibration. Too generous an offer might seem desperate, too harsh a threat could unite defenders in defiance. The Romans mastered this balance during their siege of Capua, alternating between lavish feasts for envoys and sudden displays of crucified prisoners in view of the walls. Timing turned negotiation into theater. Byzantine emperors would wait until the first winter frosts to send envoys to besieged cities, their cloaks lined with fur while asking pointedly about the defenders' dwindling firewood. The Spanish Reconquista saw commanders deliberately allow messengers from already fallen cities to slip through their lines, ensuring the next target heard first-hand accounts of both merciful treatment and brutal reprisals. These weren't just conversations, they were carefully staged performances where every prop, every pause, every unspoken implication carried meaning. But the true psychological warfare began after the ink dried on surrender terms. Ancient commanders knew that how they treated the first city to yield would echo across 100 others. When Cyrus the Great spared Babylon's citizens after their surrender, word spread like wildfire through Mesopotamia, making subsequent sieges unnaturally short. Conversely, when the Assyrians flayed a surrendering king alive despite his compliance, they gained not submission from neighbors, but fanatical resistance, proving that even in negotiation, reputation was the ultimate currency. Some cities turned the tables, using negotiation as a weapon of delay. During the siege of Lille in the 17th century, French defenders drew out talks for weeks while secretly repairing breaches under cover of diplomatic immunity. The Byzantines perfected this art, sending increasingly senior negotiators to buy time, first accountants to debate tribute payments, then bishops to discuss prisoner exchanges, until finally the emperor's brother would arrive just as reinforcements crested the horizon. These weren't stalling tactics but sophisticated plays on human psychology, exploiting the natural hesitation to attack during parleys. The most fascinating negotiations happened not between enemies, but within the besieged cities themselves. Factions would form, merchants fearing ruin, priests preaching divine intervention, soldiers vowing to fight on. Ancient accounts describe midnight councils where leaders weighed impossible choices: surrender and risk slavery, or resist and risk oblivion. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE saw such debates turn violent, with factions murdering each other over whether to accept Roman terms. This was negotiation's cruelest dimension. It forced people to put a price on their own freedom, then live with the arithmetic. What made these exchanges so potent was their ability to shift the very meaning of victory. For some defenders, surrender with honor intact protected civilians, avoided rape and pillage became a grim triumph. The Aztecs, even in defeat, negotiated to continue worshipping their gods. Medieval cities often bartered for the right to keep their bells, those symbols of civic identity. In these moments, negotiation revealed its deepest truth. It wasn't about avoiding conflict, but about choosing which scars would define the future. The nightmare of every besieged city wasn't just the enemy outside, it was the traitor within. While armies clashed at the gates, a quieter war unfolded in shadowed alleyways and whispered conversations, where a single defector could undo months of resistance. Ancient commanders knew this intimately. The strongest walls meant nothing if someone inside was willing to lift the bar. When the Persians besieged Babylon in the 6th century BCE, they didn't storm the famed impenetrable walls. They found a disgruntled priest who revealed a forgotten canal gate, turning the city's own waterways into its downfall. The real victory wasn't won by swords, but by exploiting the fractures in human loyalty. Spies didn't just gather intelligence, they weaponized paranoia. The Romans, besieging the Gallic stronghold of Alesia, intercepted messengers and replaced their letters with forgeries that exaggerated Roman numbers and hinted at non-existent betrayals. As these fake missives circulated among the defenders, every sideways glance between allies became suspicious. The Carthaginians took this further during the Sicilian Wars, planting agents who posed as deserters only to spread rumors of impending mutinies. These weren't just lies, they were psychological viruses designed to make defenders doubt their own comrades more than the enemy outside. The most devastating betrayals often came from unexpected quarters. When Constantinople faced its final siege in 1453, the Ottomans didn't rely solely on brute force. They exploited the resentment of a cannon founder named Orban, whose expertise in massive siege guns had been undervalued by the Byzantines. His defection didn't just give the Turks superior firepower, it shattered the morale of defenders who realized their own leaders had driven talent into enemy hands. Similarly, during the siege of Tyre, Alexander the Great turned exiled Phoenician nobles into willing informants, proving that the wounds of political rejection could fester into outright treachery. Yet sometimes the mere specter of betrayal was enough. The Spartans, besieging Plataea, spread word that certain houses would be spared if they marked their doors with red clay. By dawn, the city awoke to a chilling sight, dozens of markings, though no official order had been given. The panic that followed revealed a deeper truth. In the pressure cooker of a siege, fear could conjure traitors where none existed. The Assyrians capitalized on this brilliantly, launching arrows over walls with notes promising rewards to imaginary collaborators, knowing defenders would waste precious time hunting ghosts. Counterintelligence became a desperate art for those under siege. Medieval accounts describe Venetian defenders in Crete using complex password systems that changed hourly, while the Byzantines employed deaf-mute guards for sensitive meetings, a crude but effective safeguard against eavesdroppers. The defenders of Masada took perhaps the most extreme measure, destroying their own food stores to prove they couldn't be bribed into surrender. These weren't just practical precautions, they were performances of unity, meant to reassure a populace teetering on the edge of suspicion. What made insider threats so uniquely corrosive was their ability to invert a city's greatest strength community into its fatal weakness. The same bonds that let neighbors share dwindling food supplies also made betrayal cut deeper. When the Mongols besieged Samarkand, they didn't just exploit military defectors. They targeted merchants unhappy with trade restrictions, religious minorities nursing grievances, even artists resentful of patronage cuts. By the time the gates fell, the city was already fractured along lines its defenders never saw coming. In the end, no amount of stone or steel could protect against the most vulnerable point in any defense, the human heart. The most insidious sieges attacked not just the body, but the senses themselves, turning every sight, sound, and smell into instruments of torment. Imagine trying to sleep while enemy drummers pounded through the night in shifting rhythms designed to disrupt rest. The Carthaginians besieging Syracuse employed this tactic with cruel precision. their war drums mimicking heartbeat patterns just erratic enough to trigger unease. Defenders would wake exhausted without knowing why, their nerves frayed by sounds they couldn't consciously recall. Smell became a weapon when armies deliberately left corpses to rot in view of the walls. During the siege of Nicaea, crusaders described the stench of decaying horses and men as a visible fog that clung to clothing and food. The Mongols took this further, catapulting plague victims over city walls, not just to spread disease, but to saturate the air with the reek of death. In enclosed spaces where breezes couldn't carry the odor away, the psychological toll was devastating. Chroniclers wrote of defenders retching at their posts, their eyes watering so badly they couldn't spot approaching attackers. Vision was equally vulnerable to manipulation. Persian armies used polished shields to flash sunlight into sentries' eyes at random intervals, creating false alarms that kept defenders in constant tension. The Byzantines refined this into an art during their defense of Constantinople, hanging thousands of glass bottles along the walls that shattered sunlight into blinding fragments. But the cruelest visual tricks played with expectation, like the Ottoman practice of lighting extra campfires each night, making their forces appear endless, then extinguishing them suddenly to suggest an imminent attack that never came. Even taste wasn't spared. Besiegers would poison wells with bitter herbs or dead animals, ensuring every sip of water carried a reminder of their control. At the siege of Antioch, defenders reported finding their bread inexplicably salted, a subtle message that the enemy could reach them even at mealtimes. These weren't just acts of cruelty, they were calculated strikes against the mind's need for predictability. When every sense becomes unreliable, the world itself feels hostile. The genius of sensory warfare lay in its deniability. Unlike arrows or siege engines, its effects left no visible wounds. A defender complaining of phantom drumbeats or imagined smells might be dismissed as hysterical, until entire units began hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Some cities fought back with sensory countermeasures. Carthage defenders burned fragrant woods to mask the stench of corpses, while medieval castles hung wet cloths to absorb echoing noises. But the true victory went to whoever could distort reality itself, making the besieged distrust even their own eyes and ears. In this war of perception, madness was the real breach in the walls. Hope was the last fortress to fall in any siege, a fragile belief that somewhere beyond the enemy lines, allies were mustering to break the encirclement. Ancient commanders understood this psychological lifeline could be more dangerous to defenders than any shortage of arrows or grain. When the Romans laid siege to Masada, they didn't just build a ramp of earth and stone. They let Jewish defenders witness the systematic destruction of every nearby village that might have sent help. Each plume of smoke was a silent message: no one is coming. The real art lay not in crushing hope outright, but in stretching it thin enough to snap at the perfect moment. Some besiegers staged elaborate deceptions to prolong that agony. During the siege of Orleans, English forces allowed a single messenger to slip through their lines only after fabricating letters from fictional French nobles promising armies that would never arrive. The defenders, clutching those forged promises, held out for weeks longer than necessary, their morale collapsing twice as hard when the truth emerged. The Mongols took this further, dressing captured scouts in enemy uniforms and sending them back to report imaginary relief forces just days away. These weren't lies so much as psychological time bombs, set to detonate despair precisely when resistance might have crumbled naturally. Intercepting real relief efforts became a dark science. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands, the Romans didn't just defeat Carthage's fleet. They let a few battered ships escape back to Sicily, where starving defenders saw their last hope sink in the harbor. The Byzantines perfected a crueler variation. they'd permit small groups of reinforcements to reach besieged cities, only to ambush the main force later. This created a brutal paradox. The sight of a handful of survivors made the absence of the rest even more unbearable. Yet the most devastating blows came from manipulated silence. The Spartans besieging Plataea cut all messenger routes, then spread rumors that Athens had fallen. With no way to verify the claims, defenders faced an impossible choice: abandon their posts for a homeland that might already be ashes, or hold out for a rescue that might never come. The Assyrians added theatrical flair by staging fake battles just beyond the horizon. Dust clouds kicked up by cavalry, distant war cries recorded on clay tablets and played at night, all to sustain the illusion that help was perpetually almost there. Cities that resisted this tactic often did so by redefining hope altogether. During the siege of Malta in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller stopped waiting for European fleets and instead celebrated tiny victories: a successful raid for food, a repaired stretch of wall. The Aztecs, surrounded by Cortez's forces, turned their temples into stages for daily rituals proclaiming that the gods would intervene, until even the priests began whispering doubts. That was the razor's edge besiegers walked. Let hope linger too long, and defenders might rally. Crush it too soon, and you'd face desperate men with nothing left to lose. The true mastery lay in timing that final disillusionment like an executioner's blade. When the Ottomans finally broke Constantinople's walls in 1453, they made sure the defenders saw their last promised relief fleet burning in the distance. In that moment, centuries of Byzantine resilience crumbled faster than any masonry, because nothing breaks the human spirit like the certainty that you've been forgotten by the world outside. The scorched earth tactic wasn't merely about starvation. It was a brutal theater of despair staged before the first siege engine rolled into place. Imagine standing atop your city walls, watching plumes of black smoke rise from every direction, each one marking the death of a village that might have sent aid or a field that could have fed your children come winter. The Romans didn't just burn crops during their campaign against the Gauls. They salted the earth, ensuring nothing would grow for years. That wasn't pragmatism, it was psychological warfare, a way to turn the land itself into a silent herald of doom. But the true genius of this tactic lay in its ambiguity. When the Mongols swept toward a city, they left just enough farms untouched to fuel rumors. Maybe surrender would spare the rest. Defenders would waste precious days debating whether resistance was noble or futile, while the enemy methodically eliminated every alternative. The Byzantines took this further during their retreats, burning their own borderlands to create dead zones where invaders found no food, no shelter, only the creeping realization that they'd marched into a trap of their own making. The most devastating scorched earth campaigns targeted cultural touchstones. Persian armies didn't just torch granaries, they burned sacred groves and poisoned holy springs, severing the spiritual connection between people and their land. During the English Civil War, royalist forces destroyed entire market towns not for tactical gain, but to shatter the parliamentarians' belief in a peaceful countryside waiting to support them. These weren't random acts of destruction. They were calculated strikes against the stories communities told themselves about safety and identity. Yet some cities turned this tactic against their attackers. When the Russians retreated before Napoleon's advance, they left behind only ashes and well-poisoned wells, but also hidden caches of vodka spiked with belladonna. The French, desperate for supplies, drank themselves into a delirium that masked the poison's effects until it was too late. Similarly, medieval defenders in the Levant would abandon villages filled with grain infected with ergot fungus, letting the enemy's hunger do the killing for them. What made scorched earth so psychologically potent was its permanence. A broken wall could be repaired, but watching generations of harvests vanish in smoke changed something fundamental in those who witnessed it. Ancient chronicles describe farmers weeping not for their burned crops, but for the inheritance they could never pass to their children, a visceral understanding that survival might mean becoming strangers in their own land. That was the tactic's true objective, to make defenders question whether victory, if it came, would even be worth the cost. Offering surrender wasn't just about mercy, it was a psychological lever pulled with surgical precision. Ancient conquerors understood that the fastest way through a city's gates wasn't always force, but the promise of a dignified exit. When Alexander the Great besieged Tyre, his terms weren't just generous, they were performative. Defenders could march out with their arms, their families unharmed, even their honor intact, provided they surrendered before his siege towers reached the walls. The brilliance lay in the timing. By linking mercy to a visible deadline, he turned the looming engines into countdown clocks for rational decision-making. Every creak of those advancing wheels whispered a choice: pride now or survival later. But surrender terms weren't one size fits all. The Romans excelled at tailoring offers to exploit cultural values. To Gallic tribes who prized warrior status, they promised open departure with swords in hand. To Greek cities obsessed with civic memory, they guaranteed temples would stand unburned. These weren't kindnesses, they were calibrated appeals to identity, designed to make surrender feel less like defeat and more like pragmatic preservation. The Carthaginians took this further during the Sicilian Wars, allowing surrendering commanders to keep their insignia of rank. A general might lose his city, but he could still walk through the marketplace without shame, a small concession that often spared months of bloodshed. The flip side was equally calculated. After sacking a defiant city, conquerors made sure the horror stories spread. Assyrian carvings depicted rivers choked with the bones of resistors, while Mongol scouts carried illustrated scrolls showing pyramids of skulls outside rebellious walls. These weren't just records of violence, they were marketing materials for future sieges. When the Spanish conquistadors described Tenochtitlan's fall, they emphasized the Aztecs who'd surrendered early, feasting in Cortez's camp, while those who held out were reduced to eating moss. The lesson was clear: timing your surrender could mean the difference between a seat at the table and becoming part of the menu. Some commanders turned surrender into theater. During the siege of Jerusalem, Titus allowed Jewish factions to send emissaries to negotiate, but only after they'd witnessed his legions crucifying escapees along the city's perimeter. The message was layered: we'll talk, but first understand the cost of delay. The Byzantines staged even subtler performances, inviting defenders to inspect their well-fed prisoners while accidentally revealing stockpiles of siege supplies. Nothing eroded resolve like the creeping realization that the enemy could outlast you and might still offer terms tomorrow or might not. Yet the most effective surrender tactics played on hope's duality. The Ottomans, besieging Rhodes, let defenders see their wounded being treated in Turkish field hospitals, proof that compassion existed, but only if they yielded. Similarly, when Saladin reclaimed Jerusalem, he permitted Christian nobles to buy their families' freedom, turning wealth into a lifeline rather than loot. These gestures created psychological trapdoors, paths of least resistance that cleverly bypassed the instinct to fight to the last. Because the hardest walls to breach were never made of stone, they were the stories people told themselves about what surrender would cost their souls. What made these approaches so devastating was their flexibility. A commander could be merciful without being predictable, harsh without closing all exits. The art lay in making surrender feel like agency rather than failure, a choice between two futures rather than an admission of defeat. And in that space between pride and survival, countless cities discovered that the most dangerous siege engines weren't catapults or towers, but the unanswerable question, is dignity worth dying for when living honorably remains an option? Few weapons in siege warfare cut deeper than the sight of a familiar face begging for surrender from the wrong side of the walls. Ancient commanders understood that a single prisoner could accomplish what 1,000 arrows might not by turning abstract conflict into unbearable personal agony. When the Assyrians paraded captured soldiers before besieged cities, they didn't just show broken men, they staged grotesque family reunions. Imagine standing on the ramparts, recognizing your brother stripped of armor, his voice cracking as he pleads for you to open the gates. The brilliance and cruelty of this tactic lay in its simplicity. It transformed defenders into their own worst enemies, torn between duty and love. Some besiegers refined this into psychological theater. During Rome's siege of Jerusalem, Titus ordered captured Jewish rebels to build his siege works in full view of their comrades. Every hammer strike carried a dual message: physical labor for the captives, but emotional torture for those watching, forced to witness their own people aiding the enemy. The Carthaginians took this further at the siege of Acrogas, dressing prisoners in mocking replicas of their former uniforms before releasing them back to the city. These men became walking contradictions, both victims and unwitting weapons, their very presence sowing discord among defenders who couldn't decide whether to embrace them as survivors or shun them as living reminders of defeat. The most devastating manipulations targeted children. Persian chronicles describe how Cyrus the Great allowed besieged families to hear their captured sons' voices singing from the enemy camp at night, songs of home, deliberately nostalgic, piercing the darkness like arrows. The Mongols perfected a darker variation. They'd force prisoners to write letters describing their kind treatment, only to slaughter them moments after the missives were sent. When defenders later discovered the truth, the betrayal didn't just hurt morale, it poisoned the very idea of trust. Yet some cities turned this tactic against their attackers. During the siege of Leyden, Dutch defenders catapulted bread over the walls to starving Spanish captives, a move that backfired spectacularly when the enemy commander used the gesture to prove the city had food to spare. The Byzantines staged even subtler counterplays. They deliberately let high-value prisoners escape, only to have them spread carefully crafted misinformation about phantom relief armies or invented internal revolts. What made the use of captives so uniquely corrosive was its ability to collapse the moral distance between sides. A soldier facing arrows could rationalize them as tools of war, but hearing his mother's voice pleading from the enemy camp. That shattered the abstraction of battle, replacing it with unbearable intimacy. Ancient siege accounts overflow with stories of defenders who cracked not from hunger or steel, but from the accumulated weight of these personal agonies. Because no wall, no matter how thick, could shield the heart from recognizing its own. Disease was the silent siege engine, a weapon that required no battering rams or fire, yet could bring even the mightiest cities to their knees. When ancient armies surrounded a settlement, they didn't just blockade food and water. They unleashed an invisible enemy that seeped through cracks in the walls and settled in the lungs of defenders. The Mongols perfected this grim tactic, catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the walls of Kaffa in the 14th century. But long before germ theory, commanders understood the psychological power of sickness, the way it turned neighbor against neighbor, as every cough in the night became a potential death sentence. The terror of disease lay in its unpredictability. Unlike a sword strike or arrow volley, illness didn't discriminate between soldier and child, king and beggar. During the siege of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, Spartan forces watched from a safe distance as a mysterious fever ravaged the city. Thucydides described how victims huddled around sacred springs, convinced the water might save them, only to die in heaps, their faith as useless as their spears against the unseen killer. The real devastation wasn't just the bodies piling up. It was the collapse of social order, as fear of contagion made people abandon even their closest kin. Some attackers weaponized this dread with chilling creativity. Persian armies besieging Babylonian cities would contaminate water supplies with animal carcasses, letting the stench alone sow panic about poisoned wells. The Romans, during their campaign against Pontus, hurled beehives over enemy walls not for the stings, but to spread honey mixed with ergot-infected grain, inducing hallucinations among defenders who scavenged the gift. These weren't just acts of biological warfare. They were psychological operations designed to make the besieged feel their own bodies had become traitors. Yet the most insidious effect of disease was how it warped time. A battering ram might take days to breach a gate, but plague could linger for weeks, stretching the mind's endurance to its limits. Accounts from the siege of Constantinople describe defenders who'd survived Ottoman arrows only to waste away from dysentery, their final moments spent staring at untouched stockpiles of food they could no longer keep down. The Carthaginians, under Roman siege, reportedly resorted to burning their dead on makeshift pyres within the city walls, the smoke serving as a constant reminder that the enemy outside wasn't their only threat. What made biological warfare so devastating was its aftermath. Even if a city survived the siege, the scars of pestilence lingered. Survivors of the Great Plague of London in the 17th century wrote of empty chairs at dinner tables, of streets where footsteps no longer echoed because so many were gone. Ancient commanders knew this, that a population hollowed out by disease might technically surrender, but their spirit had been broken long before the gates opened. In the end, the truest measure of a siege success wasn't how many walls fell, but how thoroughly it convinced the living they were already among the dead. The towering siege engines creeping toward a city's walls were more than weapons. They were psychological hourglasses, their very existence measuring out the dwindling moments before catastrophe. Picture the dread of defenders watching an enormous battering ram take shape day by day, each new beam lashed into place echoing like a death knell. The Romans didn't just build these monstrosities for function, they constructed them in plain view, turning engineering into theater. When Julius Caesar's troops assembled a massive siege tower at Alesia, the Gauls didn't just see wood and iron, they saw their own fate being hammered together before their eyes. Some siege engines wielded symbolism as deliberately as a blade. The Assyrians painted their battering rams to resemble mythical beasts, their gaping mouthshed in gold leaf to gleam ominously in sunlight. Medieval trebuchets weren't merely catapults, they were named things like War Wolf or God Stone Thrower, their titles whispered among defenders like curses. The Ottomans took this further during the siege of Constantinople, rolling out a cannon so massive it took 60 oxen to move. Its test shots alone shattered distant farmhouses, a none too subtle preview of what would happen when it finally faced the city's fabled walls. The slow reveal was often more devastating than the machines themselves. Byzantine engineers would assemble siege towers just beyond arrow range, letting defenders count each new layer like pages in a doom-filled calendar. During the Crusades, attackers sometimes built two towers simultaneously, one real, the other a rickety decoy. The uncertainty gnawed at defenders, which one would roll forward. Where should they concentrate their precious fire barrels? This was psychological judo, transforming the defender's own vigilance into exhaustion. Yet the most brilliant commanders understood that siege engines worked best when they didn't have to. The mere threat of their arrival could collapse resistance. When Alexander approached Halicarnassus, he had his engineers accidentally leave behind detailed plans for a hypothetical siege tower, plans that conveniently fell into enemy hands. The city surrendered before the first nail was driven, their will broken by parchment and ink. Similarly, the Mongols would parade captured siege specialists through towns they planned to attack, letting word spread about the horrors these men could build. Often, the machines never materialized. The imagination of those behind the walls did the conquering for them. What made these constructions so terrifying wasn't their size, but their inevitability. A sword could miss its mark, an arrow might deflect off armor, but a 90-foot tower filled with armored soldiers, a ram that swung day and night without tiring. These were machines of mathematical certainty, their physics as remorseless as time itself. When the defenders of Tyre saw Alexander's mole inching across the sea, a land bridge swallowing the waves, they weren't just witnessing engineering. They were watching geography itself betray them. In that moment, the real battle wasn't for the walls, but for the courage to keep standing atop them. In the shadow of every siege, women and children became the silent heartbeat of resistance and the most devastating pressure point for attackers to exploit. Ancient walls didn't just shield soldiers, they protected generations of families whose very presence transformed the stakes of battle. When the Persians laid siege to Babylon, they didn't just face armed defenders on the ramparts, they confronted fathers who fought with desperate fury, knowing their children slept in houses below. But this fierce loyalty had a darker flip side. The moment a child's cry echoed through starving streets, it carried more weight than any enemy trumpet. Commanders throughout history understood this paradox, that the non-combatants who inspired defenders to hold on could also become the reason they finally let go. The strategic targeting of civilians wasn't always about cruelty. Sometimes it was cold calculus. During the Roman siege of Carthage, attackers deliberately allowed food shortages to worsen inside the city while occasionally tossing loaves over the walls. This wasn't mercy, it was psychological warfare. Mothers fighting over scraps in full view of the defenders eroded unity faster than any battering ram. The Mongols took this further, using captured children as human shields during assaults, forcing archers to choose between firing on their own kin or yielding ground. These tactics revealed a brutal truth. In siege warfare, the strongest bonds of love could be twisted into levers of surrender. Yet women and children also became unexpected instruments of defiance. Historical accounts from the Siege of Harlem describe girls pouring boiling oil from rooftops, while in medieval Chester, children formed bucket brigades to douse fires set by invaders. The Aztecs, under Spanish siege, sent women disguised as warriors to create the illusion of endless reinforcements, a trick that bought precious days. Even the act of maintaining daily routines became resistance. Mothers singing lullabies during bombardments, families planting rooftop gardens to mock the enemy's starvation tactics. These weren't just acts of survival, they were performances of normalcy, proving that life and hope could persist amid devastation. Attackers who recognized this power sometimes flipped their approach. Instead of targeting civilians, they staged spectacles of mercy. During Saladin's siege of Jerusalem, his troops escorted women and children safely through enemy lines, knowing the sight would sow doubt among defenders. Was continued resistance noble or needlessly cruel? The Assyrians perfected a darker variation. They'd release captured children unharmed but visibly traumatized, turning them into living messengers of the horrors beyond the walls. These children didn't just return to their families, they carried back invisible scars that whispered louder than any threat. The cruelest psychological games exploited cultural taboos around women's roles. When the Spartans besieged Plataea, they forced captured women to sing traditional hymns from outside the walls, a violation so profound it sparked mutiny among defenders who'd otherwise endured hunger and bombardment. The Ottomans blockading Vienna dressed male spies as midwives to infiltrate the city, exploiting the sacred trust surrounding childbirth. These weren't just breaches of security, they were attacks on the social fabric itself, making even the most intimate spaces feel vulnerable. But history also holds moments where civilians became the glue that held cities together. During the 3-year siege of Leningrad, diaries reveal how children's drawings pinned to bombed-out buildings became symbols of futurity amidst ruin. In ancient Tyre, women melted down jewelry to forge arrowheads, transforming symbols of wealth into weapons. The line between vulnerability and strength blurred entirely in these acts, proof that the people armies often dismissed as liabilities could redefine the very meaning of resilience. What made the presence of non-combatants so pivotal wasn't just their suffering or courage, but their ability to mirror a city's soul. When attackers saw women tossing roses onto enemy graves during the siege of Granada, they weren't just witnessing defiance, they were facing a culture that refused to be defined by despair. Conversely, when children's skeletons were found clutching toys in the ruins of Carthage, it wasn't just tragedy, it was the final, harrowing testament to how far a civilization would go before breaking. In the end, sieges weren't just won by armies, but by the unspoken choices of those who had no weapons, yet shaped the war all the same. Nothing shaped the psychology of siege warfare quite like the stories people told themselves about how it would end. The legend of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held back a Persian army, wasn't just history, it became a weapon wielded by both attackers and defenders for centuries. Imagine being a Greek soldier standing on the walls of your city, watching an endless enemy host approach when your commander starts invoking King Leonidas's name. Suddenly, your fear has a counterweight, the chance to become part of something immortal. That was the genius of the last stand myth. It transformed certain death into a kind of victory, making the unbearable seem noble. Attackers twisted these same stories into warnings. When the Romans besieged Numantia, they didn't just surround the city, they sent envoys to recite detailed accounts of Carthage's destruction, emphasizing how resistance had only magnified the suffering. The message was clear: your choice isn't between honor and shame, but between negotiated survival and becoming a cautionary tale. The Mongols took this further, deliberately preserving songs and poems about cities that had fought to the last man, then spreading them through traders years before their armies arrived. By the time their siege towers loomed, defenders were already haunted by ballads describing precisely how their story might end. The most potent myths blurred reality entirely. During the siege of Constantinople, Byzantine priests circulated prophecies claiming the city would never fall until the moon turned to blood, a prediction that seemed to come true during a lunar eclipse. Never mind that eclipses were predictable. In that moment of crimson light, defenders fought with renewed frenzy, while Ottoman soldiers hesitated. Similarly, medieval chronicles describe how the defenders of Chateau-Gaillard lowered a miracle cross into the enemy camp at night, knowing the glow of bioluminescent fungus would be mistaken for divine intervention. These weren't just morale boosters, they were psychological time bombs set to detonate doubt in the enemy's ranks. Yet the darkest power of these stories lay in their self-fulfilling nature. When the Aztecs recalled the legendary fall of Tolan, where brave defenders had chosen mass suicide over surrender, it wasn't just history, it was a script Cortez's siege would force them to reenact. The Jews at Masada didn't just die resisting Rome, they died performing a story they'd grown up hearing about their ancestors at Gamla. This was the paradox of the last stand myth. It could inspire unbelievable courage, but also trap people in narratives where dying well became more important than living wisely. What made these tales so enduring wasn't their accuracy, but their flexibility. A defender might see Thermopylae and think, "We can be like the Spartans," while an attacker pointed to the same battle and said, "Look how thoroughly the Persians won in the end." The real battlefield was never just the walls. It was the space between what people feared, what they hoped, and the stories that bridged the two. In sieges where time stretched into months or years, those stories often became the only rations that never ran out. A city under siege didn't just lose its walls, it lost its economy, and with it, the fragile social contracts that held society together. Picture a bustling trading hub where merchants once haggled over spices and silks, now reduced to bartering moldy grain in shadowed alleys. The moment enemy forces cut off supply lines, the very concept of wealth transformed. Gold couldn't buy bread that didn't exist, and the luxuries that once defined status became worthless overnight. This was the silent unraveling of siege warfare, where the real collapse often began not with a breach in the walls, but with the first merchant who slammed his shutters and hoarded his wares. Class divisions became fault lines under this pressure. Ancient commanders knew that a starving nobleman and a starving beggar faced the same gnawing hunger, but their desperation played out differently. The Romans besieging Capua deliberately allowed food shortages to worsen until the city's aristocracy began secretly negotiating surrender, not out of cowardice, but because their warehouses were empty for the first time in generations. Meanwhile, the poor, with nothing left to lose, often turned on their own leaders. The siege of Paris in the 14th century saw bakeries looted not by enemy soldiers, but by citizens who days earlier had been law-abiding tradesmen. Hunger didn't just weaken bodies, it rewrote loyalties. Attackers cultivated these divisions with surgical precision. When the Mongols surrounded a city, they'd send envoys to the wealthy with tailored offers. "Keep your lands, your titles, even a portion of your treasury. Just hand us the gates." The brilliance lay in the subtext. While the elite debated, the starving masses would hear whispers of betrayal. In Byzantium, besieging armies spread rumors that tax collectors were hoarding grain in subterranean vaults. It didn't matter if the vaults existed, the mere idea ignited riots that did the invaders' work for them. The cruelest economic manipulations targeted the psychology of value itself. During the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans allowed a handful of merchants to leave with their gold, only to ambush them just beyond the walls. When the looted coins were catapulted back into the city, they carried a grim lesson. Your wealth is meaningless out there, and a death sentence in here. The Carthaginians took this further, flooding besieged cities with counterfeit currency, not to destabilize markets, but to make neighbors suspect one another of collaboration when new coins appeared in desperate hands. Yet some cities fought back with economic ingenuity. Venice, under siege in the 9th century, temporarily abolished private property, turning palaces into communal storehouses to prevent hoarding. The defenders of Rhodes minted emergency currency from melted-down church silver, ensuring everyone, rich or poor, received equal rations. These weren't just survival tactics, they were acts of psychological resistance, proving that shared sacrifice could outlast calculated divide-and-conquer strategies. The true genius of economic warfare lay in its lingering scars. Long after the siege, engines were dismantled. The distrust sown between merchant and laborer, noble and peasant, often festered. A city might rebuild its walls in a season, but the memory of who ate while others starved could poison generations. That was the ultimate objective, to make sure that even if the gates never fell, the society behind them would never be the same. Weather was the one enemy no city wall could keep out, a force as indifferent to defenders as it was to attackers, yet ancient commanders learned to wield it with brutal precision. Imagine sweltering through a summer siege where the enemy deliberately cut off your water supply, letting the sun do their work as thirst drove men to lick dew from stones. Or picture winter's grip tightening around a starving city, where the cold didn't just numb fingers, it shattered morale, turning every frostbitten sentry into a walking advertisement for surrender. The Carthaginians besieging Syracuse in Sicily didn't just wait for winter. They redirected mountain streams to flood the city's outskirts, forcing defenders to wade through icy sludge during nighttime raids. Nature became an accomplice, amplifying human suffering without a single arrow being loosed. Timing was everything. The Mongols didn't accidentally find themselves outside Russian cities when the snows came. They planned it, knowing frozen rivers would serve as highways for their horsemen while paralyzing defenders accustomed to summer trade routes. During the siege of Moscow in the 16th century, Polish forces watched as early thaws turned the surrounding plains to mud, bogging down their cannons. But instead of retreating, they spread rumors that the unseasonable warmth was divine favor, convincing starving Muscovites their own gods had abandoned them. Weather wasn't just a condition, it was a narrative, and the side that controlled the story often controlled the outcome. Some commanders manipulated weather perception through sheer theater. When Alexander's army marched through the Gedrosian desert, they didn't hide their suffering. They let defenders see them drinking from drained wells and staggering under the heat, knowing word would spread about the hellscape awaiting anyone who resisted. The Byzantines took the opposite approach during a siege of Bulgarian forts, lighting massive bonfires during blizzards to create the illusion of warm, well-supplied camps. Defenders peering through the storm saw flickering lights where none should exist, fueling whispers of sorcery or divine intervention. The cruelest weather tactics exploited cultural vulnerabilities. Roman legions besieging Germanic tribes timed attacks to the autumn equinox, when pagan defenders would be weakened from days of ritual fasting. Spanish conquistadors in the Andes waited for rainy season to assault Inca strongholds, knowing their enemies' cotton armor turned into heavy, freezing shrouds when soaked. Even sound could be weaponized. Viking raiders used winter winds to carry the echoes of their war drums across frozen lakes, making a handful of attackers sound like an approaching army. Yet nature was a fickle ally. The same storms that starved defenders could trap attackers in muddy quagmires, as the French learned during their retreat from Moscow. The same droughts that dried up a city's wells might also parch the besiegers' throats, as crusaders discovered outside Damascus. The true masters of weather warfare, like the Ottomans at Constantinople, didn't just rely on natural cycles. They staged their own disasters, using early gunpowder to trigger avalanches or diverting rivers to flood tunnels. Their genius lay in making the indiscriminate seem intentional, until every raindrop felt like part of the enemy's plan. What made weather such a devastating psychological tool was its universality. A soldier might rationalize an enemy's sword as mortal danger, but when the very air conspired against him, when his breath froze inside his helmet or his thirst drove him to drink filthy puddles, it eroded something deeper than courage. It made the world itself feel hostile. Ancient accounts describe defenders who willingly walked into blizzards rather than face another day of siege, not because they feared death, but because they could no longer bear the indifference of the skies overhead. In the end, the weather didn't break cities, it broke the human spirit's ability to distinguish between catastrophe and mere Tuesday. Silence could be more unnerving than any war cry, a calculated void where expectation festered into dread. Ancient commanders knew that the moments between assaults weren't just pauses, they were psychological battlegrounds, Picture defenders standing on rain-slicked walls, squinting into the pre-dawn gloom, straining to hear the telltale clank of armor or the creak of siege engines. But there's nothing, just the wind, just the distant call of a night bird, just the unbearable weight of not knowing whether the next heartbeat would bring relief or ruin. This was the art of weaponized stillness, where time itself became a torturer. The Romans mastered this cruel symphony of suspense during their siege of Masada. For weeks they built their siege ramp in silence, forbidding even the clatter of tools after dusk. Jewish rebels atop the cliffs would wake to find the earthworks mysteriously advanced, as if the very ground were betraying them. The lack of noise didn't mean safety, it meant inevitability. Similarly, Ottoman sappers tunneling beneath Constantinople's walls worked under layers of felt to muffle their picks, leaving defenders to press ears against cold stone, imagining threats they couldn't confirm. The terror wasn't in what they heard, but in what they might be missing. Some armies took silence further, orchestrating false lulls. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish forces besieging Magdeburg would stage sudden withdrawals, only to return days later when defenders had begun dismantling barricades. The Carthaginians besieging Syracuse went darker still. For 3 days straight, they allowed no attacks, no shouts, not even campfires after dark. On the fourth night, when sentries had grown accustomed to the quiet, hundreds of grappling hooks flew over the walls simultaneously. The lesson was brutal. Trust in silence could be as deadly as fear of noise. The psychological toll of this tactic revealed itself in unexpected ways. Medieval chronicles describe defenders who hallucinated phantom armies in the fog, or who fired arrows at shadows moving in distant tree lines. During the siege of Harfleur, English archers reported French soldiers pleading for them to just attack already, anything to end the waiting. The most insidious effect wasn't fatigue, but the erosion of trust in one's own senses. When the Norman conquerors besieging Malta let days pass without action, they didn't just break focus. They made every creaking door or snapped twig feel like an omen, turning the defenders' own environment against them. Yet some cities weaponized the silence right back. The defenders of Rhodes would deliberately lower empty buckets on ropes at random intervals, forcing Ottoman sentries to waste arrows on non-existent threats. Byzantine garrisons staged fake musters in moonlit courtyards, their silent formations visible from afar but dissolving before dawn. These weren't just tricks, they were acts of psychological judo, flipping the torment of uncertainty back onto the attackers. Because in the end, the fear of what might come was always more powerful than the thing itself, and whoever controlled that fear held the real advantage. History wasn't just recorded in the aftermath of sieges, it was wielded as a weapon during them. Cities that had withstood legendary assaults didn't just survive, they became living myths, their walls echoing with the whispers of past defiance. Take Saguntum, the Spanish fortress that held out against Hannibal for 8 grueling months in the 3rd century BCE. Long after its eventual fall, its name was invoked by Roman generals to shame hesitant allies. Will you surrender faster than Saguntum? The irony was brutal. The city's real power emerged not in victory, but in the way its loss became a rallying cry for others. This was the paradox of siege legacies. Sometimes being remembered as the city that refused to break mattered more than the outcome itself. The most resilient cities transformed their suffering into identity. When the tiny Greek island of Saura was obliterated by Ottoman forces in 1824, the survivors didn't just mourn. They turned their last stand into poetry, songs, and secret toasts that kept resistance alive for generations. Similarly, the defenders of Vienna in 1683 didn't just repel the Turks. They curated every relic of the siege, from broken lances to blood-stained banners. arranging them in churches like sacred trophies. These artifacts weren't displays of vanity, they were psychological armor, proof that survival was possible even against impossible odds. Visitors would touch the scorched timbers and think, if they endured, so can we. Attackers understood this power all too well. The Assyrians didn't just raze rebellious cities, they systematically erased their memory, smashing statues, burning libraries, and even sowing salt into the earth. After Rome destroyed Carthage, they passed laws forbidding anyone to live on its ruins for 100 years, ensuring no survivor could whisper tales of the city's former glory. The message was clear: resistance wouldn't just cost you your present, it would steal your past and future too. Yet some legacies proved unkillable. When archaeologists unearthed Carthage centuries later, they found fragments of children's toys hidden in cellar holes, tiny, defiant proof that life had clung on despite the empire's decree. The weight of history could bend the present in unexpected ways. During the siege of Shajdvar in 1566, Ottoman troops hesitated to assault certain walls because local legends claimed the ghost of King Matthias haunted them. The Spanish, besieging a Dutch fortress in the 80 Years' War, abandoned their camp after townspeople staged nightly reenactments of a mythical victory from 2 centuries prior. These weren't just superstitions, they were psychological warfare waged with the weapons of memory. A single well-told story about ancestral valor could stiffen spines more effectively than 1,000 fresh recruits. But the most fascinating legacies were those that transcended their original context. The Alamo fell in 1836, yet its doomed defenders somehow inspired victories they'd never lived to see. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 ended in annihilation, but became a global symbol of resistance precisely because it was hopeless. What made these stories endure wasn't military success, it was the raw humanity they revealed. A child scratching their name into a cellar wall, a baker still making bread as the bombs fell, a soldier laughing on the ramparts at dawn. These fragments of normalcy amid chaos became the seeds of legends. Because in the end, sieges weren't just about who held the ground, they were about who held the story. The moment a city's gates creaked open didn't mark the end of psychological warfare, it signaled the start of its most calculated phase. Conquerors understood that how they treated the defeated would echo far beyond broken walls, shaping rebellions yet to come. Take Alexander the Great's approach after the fall of Tyre. He crucified 2,000 defenders along the shoreline, but spared the city's aristocracy and even attended their religious rites. This wasn't random cruelty, it was a meticulously staged performance. The crosses warned potential rebels of the cost of defiance, while his respect for local elites gave collaborators an honorable exit. Every gesture, from the whip to the handshake, carried intentional weight. Some victors weaponized mercy with equal precision. When Saladin reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187, he allowed most citizens to buy their freedom rather than enslaving them. But this clemency came with strings attached. Wealthy Franks paid exorbitant ransoms, while the poor were released first, ensuring stories of Islamic generosity spread through Europe's lower classes. Contrast this with the Mongols' sack of Nishapur, where artisans were spared while every noble's head adorned a pyramid of skulls. Both strategies achieved the same goal, rewriting the rules of surrender for the next city on their path. The darkest psychological plays unfolded in the gray area between life and death. Roman conquerors often staged elaborate executions for rebel leaders, but only after granting them a mock trial and merciful delay. The message wasn't just about punishment, it was about demonstrating that even justice itself answered to the conqueror's whims. The Ottomans refined this into an art after taking Constantinople. forcing defeated Byzantine officials to watch as their precious church mosaics were covered in whitewash, not destroyed but hidden, a perpetual reminder that their world could be erased with a bucket of lime. Yet the most effective post-siege tactics targeted memory itself. Carthage's fields were plowed with salt not to sterilize the earth, a practical impossibility, but to create a generations-long legend about the price of defiance. When the Spanish conquered Granada, they preserved the Alhambra's beauty while systematically rewriting its inscriptions, allowing the palace to stand as a hollow testament to vanished glory. These weren't acts of destruction, but of curation, selectively editing history to make resistance seem not just futile, but forgettable. The true genius of these aftermath strategies lay in their flexibility. A commander could be both brutal and benevolent, letting observers draw their own conclusions. After suppressing the Jewish revolt in 70 CE, Rome minted coins commemorating Julia Capta, alongside images of weeping prisoners, yet simultaneously granted tax breaks to cities that surrendered early. The paradox forced every future rebellion to gamble. Would they be the next martyrs or the next beneficiaries? In this way, the real conquest didn't happen when the walls fell, but when the defeated started measuring their choices against the ghosts of those who came before. The psychological warfare of ancient sieges never truly vanished, it simply evolved, adapting its timeless tactics to the battlefields of today. Consider the parallels between Assyrian commanders flinging clay tablets of fake prophecies over city walls and modern armies dropping leaflets with tailored messages over enemy territory. The medium has shifted from parchment to pixels, but the goal remains unchanged: to plant seeds of doubt that grow into surrender. Even the blockade, one of the oldest siege strategies, finds its echo in modern economic sanctions. Just as ancient cities withered without grain shipments, entire nations now buckle under carefully calculated restrictions on oil, medicine, or banking, proof that starvation takes many forms, and some of the hungriest battles are fought not with bullets but with spreadsheets. Look closer at the siege of Mariupol in 2022, where Russian forces replicated techniques straight from antiquity. They didn't just cut off food and water, they hijacked radio frequencies to broadcast loops of surrender demands, mimicking the Roman practice of parading well-fed prisoners before starving defenders. The chilling twist: modern technology amplified these tactics exponentially. Drone footage of ruined neighborhoods became the digital equivalent of Assyrian reliefs depicting sacked cities, a warning to anyone considering resistance. Meanwhile, social media transformed every civilian with a smartphone into both witness and weapon, as hashtags and live streams became the new siege towers, scaling the walls of global public opinion. Yet the most haunting continuity lies in the exploitation of hope. Ancient commanders like Titus allowed besieged Jews to glimpse fictional relief armies on the horizon. Today, disinformation campaigns manufacture identical illusions with deepfake videos of approaching reinforcements. The siege of Aleppo saw rebels clinging to rumors of American airstrikes that never came, just as Carthaginian defenders once prayed for Ptolemaic fleets that would never sail. The human mind, it seems, remains as vulnerable to the promise of salvation as it was 2,000 years ago, and just as easily broken when that promise proves empty. But there's a crucial difference. Ancient cities stood alone, their suffering visible only to those outside the walls. Modern conflicts unfold under the glare of satellite imagery and smartphone cameras, where starvation becomes a spectator sport. The real innovation isn't in the tactics themselves, but in how they're obscured: sanctions framed as targeted measures, propaganda laundered through algorithms, blockades justified as quarantines. The language has grown sophisticated, but the playbook would feel intimately familiar to a Roman centurion or Mongol general. After all, the goal was never just to conquer land, but to convince the conquered they were always meant to lose. Perhaps the most telling evolution is in scale. Where ancient sieges targeted single cities, modern psychological warfare blankets entire populations. The Soviet Union's Holodomor weaponized famine across Ukraine in the 1930s just as thoroughly as the Romans starved Veii, but with bureaucratic efficiency that multiplied the suffering exponentially. Similarly, ancient commanders who forged letters to spark infighting would marvel at today's social media bots, algorithmically amplifying division at speeds unthinkable in the age of clay tablets. The tools have changed, but the truth endures. In war, the mind remains the final frontier, and every advance in technology simply offers new ways to storm its gates. This isn't just history repeating itself, it's history refining itself. The Aztecs hurled sacred knives from their temples to demoralize Spanish invaders. Now, nations leak compromising videos to erode enemy morale. The Byzantines staged fake miracles with glowing fungus. Today, armies deploy AI-generated leaks indistinguishable from reality. The through line is undeniable. Whether you're defending Constantinople's Theodosian walls or a Ukrainian server farm, victory belongs to those who control the narrative. Because while siege engines may rust and city walls crumble, the human psyche remains the most permanent and vulnerable fortress of all. Constantinople's Theodosian walls didn't just stand tall, they cast a shadow across centuries, their very name whispering a dare to would-be conquerors. These weren't mere barriers of stone, they were psychological monoliths, their reputation woven into the fabric of history long before any enemy approached. For over 900 years, they repelled invaders not just with their triple-layered defenses, but with the crushing weight of inevitability they imposed. Imagine being an attacking general staring up at those 50-foot ramparts, knowing that every army before you had failed. The walls themselves were daunting, but the real deterrent was the stories, the whispered accounts of the Avars who broke their siege engines against them, the Arabs who starved in their tents, the Bulgarians who left behind pyramids of their own dead. This was the paradox of unbreakable cities. Their greatest strength wasn't in what they were, but in what everyone believed they could never be. The psychology of invincibility worked both ways. Inside Constantinople, the walls became a kind of civic religion. Children grew up tracing their fingers along the same mortar their ancestors had defended. Sentries standing watch weren't just guarding stone, they were upholding a legacy. When the Rus fleet attacked in the 10th century, defenders reportedly poured Greek fire from the battlements while priests paraded sacred relics along the walkways, merging military might with divine sanction. The message to attackers was clear: you're not just fighting us, you're fighting destiny itself. And when the enemy faltered, as they always did, it reinforced the myth, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of dread for outsiders and zeal for defenders. Other cities achieved similar legendary status through sheer stubbornness. The island fortress of Tyre held out against Alexander the Great for 7 months, its defenders so confident in their island redoubt that they mockingly asked if the Macedonian god-king could walk on water. Even after Alexander's engineers built his infamous mole to reach them, the Tyrians fought room by room, forcing the conqueror to pay for every inch of rubble with blood. Their eventual fall couldn't erase their defiance. If anything, it burnished their reputation, ensuring that future attackers would think twice before engaging in another meat grinder of a siege. But reputation alone wasn't enough. Unbreakable cities mastered the art of visible readiness. Constantinople's defenders didn't just have walls, they had the world's largest stockpile of Greek fire, its secret formula guarded like state secrets. Rhodes boasted a garrison so disciplined that visiting crusaders reported seeing knights practice sword drills at midnight by torchlight. These displays weren't just practical, they were performances, carefully staged to unsettle spies and traders who'd carry tales of impregnable defenses back to potential enemies. The Venetians took this further, deliberately leaking exaggerated accounts of their arsenal during peace negotiations, letting ink and parchment do the work of deterrence. The true test of these legendary defenses came when they finally fell. When Mehmed II breached Constantinople's walls in 1453, it wasn't because the fortifications failed, it was because centuries of psychological armor had slowly corroded. The empire's shrinking territory meant fewer farmers to feed the city, fewer soldiers to man the ramparts, fewer allies to send reinforcements. Yet even in its twilight, the myth held power. Mehmed had to haul ships overland to bypass the chain across the Golden Horn, a gambit so audacious it seemed to prove that only the impossible could conquer the unconquerable. The walls didn't collapse that day, they were outflanked by sheer force of will, a reminder that no defense is truly eternal. What made these cities extraordinary wasn't their physical defenses, but their ability to live rent-free in the minds of enemies. Like a chess grandmaster who wins before making a move, their power lay in making attackers question themselves long before the first arrow flew. From the cliffside monasteries of Meteora to the floating garrisons of Venice, their legacies whisper a timeless lesson. The strongest walls are the ones people believe in. The sieges of antiquity reveal a timeless truth. The most formidable walls were never made of stone, but of the human spirit. Ancient commanders understood this better than anyone, wielding psychological weapons with the same precision as swords and spears. Whether it was the Assyrians parading severed heads to break morale, the Romans starving cities into submission while dangling mercy just out of reach, or the Mongols weaponizing rumors to turn allies against one another, every tactic shared a common goal: to conquer the mind before the body. These weren't just battles of attrition, they were masterclasses in manipulation, where victory often went to whoever could make their enemy believe defeat was inevitable long before the final blow landed. What makes these ancient strategies so chillingly relevant is how little human nature has changed. The fear of isolation, the terror of the unknown, the desperate cling to hope, these emotions still dictate modern conflicts, from cyber warfare to economic sanctions. When a hacker paralyzes a city's infrastructure or a propaganda machine floods social media with disinformation, they're employing the same principles Carthaginian generals used when they forged letters to spark infighting in besieged cities. The tools have evolved, but the target remains unchanged, the fragile space between perception and reality. Yet history's greatest sieges also teach us about resilience. For every city that crumbled under psychological pressure, there were those like Masada or Tyre, where defenders turned desperation into defiance. Their stories remind us that unity and ingenuity can outlast even the most relentless sieges. The Byzantines surviving centuries of attacks by adapting their defenses, the Maltese knights enduring starvation through sheer discipline, the Aztecs resisting Cortés despite overwhelming odds. These weren't just military feats. They were triumphs of collective will, proving that a people who refuse to see themselves as defeated cannot truly be conquered. As we reflect on these ancient struggles, their lessons echo far beyond the battlefield. In our own lives, we face sieges of a different kind: personal, professional, societal. The same tactics apply: the lies that sow doubt, the fears that paralyze action, the hope that fuels perseverance. Understanding how civilizations weathered these assaults gives us a playbook for resilience, because whether facing an enemy army or life's uncertainties, the outcome often hinges not on the strength of our walls, but on the steadfastness of our mind. So what do you think? Which siege tactic, from the Trojan horse's deception to the Mongols' engineered terror, resonates most with you? Share your thoughts below. And if you found this journey into history's shadow wars enlightening, don't forget to subscribe. The past is full of untold battles, and together we'll uncover every one.